Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I finally got my hands on some Gesellen Fechten footage. Unfortunately though, the footage that I have of the Tier A longsword pool looks like it was filmed through the walls of a neglected fish tank. So we have to kind of work with what we got. On top of that, the good people at Gesellen Fechten decided that they were going to have pools instead of brackets for their finals, which normally actually isn't a problem. It's in a lot of ways a lot more enjoyable. However, in order to accommodate the time factor of doing so many pools, there were only 5 exchanges for each fight, which is a criminally low number of exchanges to have, especially given that the entire finals pool only had 6 people in it. So I can't really do anything about the fact that I have a very, very short amount of footage to go over, but despite all of this, I did manage to find one fight that I found to be really exciting and really interesting, and that was the fight between Chandler Brown and Gavin Page. And it was pretty exciting because there was a couple of really nice adaptations, and when you only have 5 exchanges to adapt, every single one really, truly matters. So, with that, let's get into it. So for the duration of this fight, the brownish fish on the left is going to be Chandler Brown, and the classic HEMA black with basketball shorts fish on the right is going to be Gavin. And for our first exchange, we see Gavin come in with a very nice ballistic thrust. You can see in the slow-mo here that he really gets a nice extension at his shoulder line with great precision, but unfortunately he did it just a slightly bit too far out of range, which means that Chandler was able to parry his blow off to the side and throw a nice left Zverik as a counter. The reason he was able to do this, of course, is that when you're throwing really high intensity thrusts, one of the problems is that if you don't reach your target, there's no force pushing back on you that's stopping you or slowing you down, which means you often have to take at least 1 or sometimes 2 steps to slow yourself down and take yourself to a complete stop, which in that time is more than enough of an opportunity for your opponent to beatbox your kidneys with some Zverkows. But there is one thing that maybe Gavin could have maybe done a little bit better here, which is that as you see him come forward into this bind as he misses his thrust, he doesn't really do enough to try to bind up the hands of Chandler. Despite the fact that Chandler throws a left Zverik here, which is classically pretty hard to bind up, you can see that Gavin sort of resigns himself to death after he realizes he misses this thrust, and instead he could have maybe shoved his hands into Chandler's or into his face in order to try to put Chandler off balance enough that it might have ruined his Zverkow. Overall, I'm not even sure that would have really saved him, but it is always worth a try. And if you're in that situation yourself, it is definitely something that you should look to do every time you miss a thrust, because even if it only saves you 3 times out of 10, that's still 3 times you don't end up getting hit. For our next exchange, we start off with a little bit of a footwork game. Now, when you want to look at and analyze footwork in a competitive fight, the one thing you want to pay attention to is who is initiating the footwork and who is responding to the footwork. And in this particular case, what we see is both Chandler and Gavin going back and forth trying to set the tempo where they're the one who gets to do the footwork while their opponent responds, only to find that about halfway through this little delicate dance, Gavin attempts to go for a hand shot at the exact same time as Chandler goes for a leg shot. Now, the reason that Chandler was able to get that leg shot off what appears to be completely free is because of the distance that they were at. And the reason they were at the distance they were at is because they were still in the middle of playing their footwork games. One of the things that's really important when trying to win a footwork game is you have to make sure that you get your opponent to either move into or out of range against their will, more or less. So if you move forward, you want your opponent to then start moving backwards. This is your opportunity to essentially charge them, knowing that they're going to be moving backwards and they don't expect anything to happen. Similarly, if you start to move backwards or pretend to move backwards and they start moving forwards, this is again your opportunity to try to hit them as they're coming forward, again against their will, more or less. And in this particular exchange, what we see is that technically speaking, both of them had kind of reset in their footwork game, but the last person to make the move was Gavin. And I think that what Gavin was trying to do was he was trying to set up the footwork trap where he pretended to move backwards, and then as Chandler moved into range, he would hand snipe him and move out of the way. Unfortunately, that's not what ended up happening, because what Chandler did in response to this footwork trap was not to move forward without any kind of attack, but to move with a very intelligent kind of attack for this situation, which is a very, very uncommitted attack to a low priority target that's basically impossible to parry. By throwing this one-handed cut towards Gavin's leg, what he essentially assumed was that If Gavin had moved backwards, that he would have missed, but he would have been out of range for any follow-up attack that Gavin might have had for them. At the exact same time, because Chandler didn't have to move very far forward in order to throw this one-handed attack, he was more or less completely safe from any counterattack that Gavin might have thrown if he hadn't moved at all, which is what happened. Gavin, who hadn't moved his feet in any meaningful direction, tried to counterattack the Gesellen immediately and did a really good job of responding quickly, but still found himself out of range. And that is because the Gesellen, in this particular case, has that extra 8 to 10 inches of range by using the bottom of the grip of the sword as your point of reference. As you see here, Chandler grabs his sword with his left hand at the very, very bottom, which gives him that extra reach and allows him to hit with a pretty decent amount of percussion to the leg while not being able to be hit in the hands back. Next up, we have a pretty long exchange between our two fighters, and the length of this exchange is pretty important to why it ends the way that it ends. Now, previously in our other two exchanges, we've seen a lot of real heavy footwork from both fencers. Chandler, who's bouncing around pretty light on his feet, moving in and out of range rather rapidly. Gavin, who takes a slightly shorter stance and tends to stand his ground a little bit better, is a bit more based for offensive attacks and defensive attacks, but isn't quite able to keep up with that kind of footwork. However, Gavin clearly has noticed that Chandler has a very deep stance when he's sitting in his guard, and as a result takes advantage of that when he goes in for his really, really low and deep right Zwerchhau. Now, this is something that I've frankly never seen anybody actually pull off, but it's rather intelligent. As you saw from the previous exchange, one of the caveats of going for somebody's leg is that you leave your head open. And this is still true of this particular technique. However, what Gavin is doing here is he's trying to minimize that opening as much as possible in both his selection of technique and the kind of lunge that he does in order to throw it. You see him go into a pretty deep lunge here, but not so deep that he ends up too far below Chandler's shoulder line. At the exact same time, he raises his hands very high up into the air, and with a surprising amount of precision, throws a right Zwerchhau so low as to hit Chandler in the ankle or the lower shin. The reason he is doing this, of course, is that in this position with his hands very high and his tip very low, his guard and the strong of his blade is actually in a pretty nice position to protect him from any afterblow that might come from the left or the right side towards his head, which, if you've ever attacked someone in the leg before, you know that getting hit in the head is your primary concern, because when you have to lower your body line and your hands in order to hit somebody in a low target, it opens up your head and it makes you completely vulnerable. So this was a really interesting adaptation, not only to Chandler's stance, which was very far forward and a little bit vulnerable to this particular kind of technique, but also the way that he throws this leg shot in comparison to the one Chandler just threw is in a lot of ways a lot more defended and a lot more smart in that it has a much higher chance of using more than just distance as keeping itself safe after it lands. Next up, we have a really complicated exchange. Complicated not in its execution, but in its setup. So what happens first is Chandler throws a baited left cut towards Gavin's hands, which really didn't have any distance to make it, but does result in a kind of setup. You see, Gavin, upon seeing Chandler try to snipe the right side of his hands, shifts his guard to his right side. A pretty smart thing to do. At which point Chandler continues to walk forward and telegraphs the fact that he is going to try to snipe Gavin in the hands in the same spot again. And the reason this is so intelligent is because what it has done is it has forced Gavin to shift his guard into a position where he is not vulnerable to the thing that Chandler is provoking him with, but he is vulnerable to something else. Upon seeing Gavin shift his guard and continue to walk backwards in a defensive mindset, Chandler seizes his opportunity and throws, instead of a left cut towards his hands, a Zwerchhau straight down the middle. And the reason this is successful in landing is, one, in part because he had shifted Gavin's guard not only to the right side, but low to the right side, which meant that in order to push that Zwerchhau out of the way, Gavin would have had to cross from his lower right opening all the way to his upper left in order to not get stabbed, which is, of course, a really long distance to travel. But more than that, what it means is that when Chandler came forward, The first couple of milliseconds of this attack, Gavin is looking to do a completely different kind of parry. He is expecting another left cut, or at worst, a cut on the opposite side. And by completely subverting those expectations and going for a thrust down the middle, along the high line and the shoulder area, Gavin had a couple of milliseconds where he thought he had two choices to choose from and was suddenly found himself being assaulted by a third option. This is a great way and a great demonstration of how you can set up your own fantastic attacks in your own fencing. Because at the end of the day, if you are telegraphing something over and over again and someone makes an adjustment to you, there is a version of reality here where you actually have control of the situation, at least more than you maybe think you do. If it's your favorite technique that you keep telegraphing over and over again, well, chances are the other person is going to parry it when you throw it. But if you instead telegraph something that you really don't intend on landing, especially something that goes to a low priority target like the hand or the leg, you can often use it as a great setup in order to get someone to shift their guard into something that is now no longer conducive to protecting their inner targets like their chest or their head. So we come now to the final exchange of this all too short fight, and we see some more footwork games. Only this time we see Gavin taking advantage of the footwork. In this particular case, what happens is Gavin walks forward into range and threatens with his low right Zwerchhau to the leg again, in an attempt to get Chandler to try to pull his leg back. Chandler, who doesn't want to get sniped in the ankle again, pulls his leg and attempts to defend himself from this attack, couching something of his own to respond to the head, just in case Gavin actually throws it. Of course, it was a feint on the side of Gavin, which means that when Chandler does this very short and choppy footwork to try to protect his leg, Gavin seizes this opportunity by trying to snipe, instead of the leg, the arm of Chandler. Now, Chandler does a very, very good job of parrying this strike. However, it is clear from the body language of Chandler here that he did not expect this, and he has been put into a defensive mindset. And Gavin seizes on this defensive mindset almost immediately. Upon seeing that Chandler is going to continue to try to take his distance, and he's still a little confused as to what may or may not be coming at him, Gavin walks forward with 3 simple steps, each one throwing a kind of mini feint just to see what Chandler would do, and Chandler starts to kind of ignite his brain a bit. He starts trying to block all kinds of different openings, all kinds of attacks, and you can see that he's just a little bit overwhelmed with all of the options, at which point Gavin throws one last feint that appears to go high and throws a very nice middle cut straight across at the belly line that hits Chandler in the hands. Now, when watching the slow-mo, you can see here that Chandler still put up a really, really good parry for this hand strike. The only problem, of course, is that Gavin seems to have an absolute sniper's resolve when it comes to hitting these tiny little gaps. Despite the fact that Chandler had his crossguard and his point pointed to the exact angle that it should have been, and he got his hands more or less low enough, the problem is that this middle howl from Gavin came in right about the hip line, which, as you know, is really, really difficult to parry. So even though Chandler put up a really great parry here that would have probably blocked 90% of descending cuts towards his hand, it couldn't quite get that middle angle, and as a result, he got a clean shot to the hands. Now, the other thing to point out here is that immediately upon getting hit in the hands, Chandler attempts to throw a counterattack of his own, and this is where we have to talk about footwork again, because every single time that Gavin came forward, Chandler moved backwards. And as I said earlier, one of the key things in the battle of footwork is who is making the action and who is making the response. Every single time Gavin moved his foot forward, Chandler moved backwards. Although, again, because Chandler's not psychic, a little bit slower than Gavin was moving forward. This is inevitable. And at the very final moment where Gavin landed his strike, Chandler was still in the middle of moving backwards. That tiny little hesitation and that tiny little bit of backwards momentum was all that it took to ruin Chandler's counterattack, something that normally he might have been able to do pretty easily in doubling to the head and maybe getting out ahead on a afterblow 2.1 point rule set. This particular interaction shows just how powerful these kinds of footwork traps can be in keeping you safe in what would otherwise be a pretty unsafe situation. So, unfortunately, like I said, that is the last exchange. And despite the fact that this was a pretty exciting fight, I would behoove people who are maybe running events of their own to keep in mind that if at the very least you're going to continue with this final pool style format, please at least give them a couple more exchanges, because, at least from my perspective, it feels kind of bad to see that this really great fight between two really great fencers just didn't have the chance to run the distance because they just had to stop and move on to a different fight. But if you still think that's great and you want to see some more of this, tune in next week when I'm going to have more fights and more tournaments.